Welcome to the European report, back after a one-year pause in a new format. Again, we are not, as you can see, in the facilities of the European Parliament, but spread out in three different locations today with Bert-Jan Ruissen from the Netherlands and Charlie Weimers from Sweden, both members of the ECR group in the European Parliament. Before we start, gentlemen, let me just say a few words of introductions for those who are new. We have done these European reports for the last 10 years or so. This is, of course, a talk show about recent events and developments in the Middle East and Israel as it relates to Europe, but also a program where we are monitoring the situation for European Jewry and world Jewry. And on that note, of course, it's important to note that today is the eve of Purim, this important religious, Jewish religious holiday when they remember the threat to exterminate the Jewish people some 2,400 years ago in Persia. This is something we can read about in the book of Esther, how Queen Esther was able to save her people. Let me also say that exactly 18 years ago on this day, a number of European leaders met in the European Parliament in Brussels and formed what would later become the European Coalition for Israel, with two objectives: one, to fight anti-Semitism, the second objective, to foster good relations between Europe and Israel. And the rest is history, as the saying goes. And today we are very happy and fortunate to be joined in the program by two friends, friends of ECI, but also equally friends of Israel and the Jewish people, Charlie Weimers and Bert-Jan Ruissen. Let me start, perhaps, Charlie, with you, and I do hope that our connection will work. This is always a bit risky in these days, but coming back on that very note, you have now, last time we met was more than 1 year ago. After that, in February and more so in March, something happened that paralyzed not only European society, but basically global society. And we have not been able to meet in person ever since. But how is this new reality? I mean, being a member of European Parliament, is it possible to be a member of European Parliament and work from a distance? Charlie.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me in the show, and it's good to see you again, Tomas. Time flies indeed, yeah, let's hope the connection works. This is a perfect example of this slowness of the European institutions, not to equip their work with the capacity to do webinars like this, because I am sitting here in Parliament at my stationary computer with supposed access to the broadband of the European Parliament, but it points at a larger problem. Yeah, it had a big effect, of course, like it. Pandemic has had a effect on everyone around the world. I mean, on the positive side, it has been a great opportunity for the Parliament to become more digital, which is to be welcomed. But I must say, nothing is like having discussions and exchanges of views in person, especially when it relates to sensitive matters. So I would say I welcome that certain procedures like votes can now be done digitally, but I also very much look forward to some normality post-COVID and a return to the dynamics and the vibe that existed here in the parliament before COVID.
Thank you, Charlie. And you are in Belgium, if I'm not mistaken, and Bert-Jan is on the other side of the border in the Netherlands. And I think we can commend the Dutch government for providing good Wi-Fi, because I think we have a clear line. But Bert-Jan, what are your observations?
Yes, indeed, the pandemic has changed all our lives, and also our way of working quite substantial indeed. So personally, I am working mainly in my local office here in the Netherlands. So that has also some advantages indeed. So more time for family life and less traveling and so on. As you know, Brussels indeed is still open. So sometimes I go to Brussels for important meetings. But we have cancelled all our activities in Strasbourg. And I think that was one of the best decisions we have ever taken, I think, as Parliament. And speaking about lessons for the future, well, that's one of our lessons, I think. We learn in this period, this time, that we can do our work without traveling to Strasbourg. So that is one of the things we can do. Let's close Strasbourg. That's my proposal. Yeah.
So you are saving us a lot of money as EU taxpayers for next budget year.
Yes, indeed.
we all hope so. Staying on the topic of the pandemic, and obviously this has been the number one policy issue throughout the year, which also brings us to Israel. And as we've seen in the last few weeks, there has been so many delays and problems, especially within the EU. The UK has done better in their vaccination plan. But one country in particular has done extremely well, and that is the state of Israel. So this raises the question, obviously with the pandemic being the number one policy issue, has this given Israel new friends in the European Parliament? Has this finally been a chance to say that we can learn something from Israel? Or is it perhaps the other way around? Bert-Jan, if we start with you.
Yes, indeed. Speaking about the vaccination campaign, we can say that Israel is, let's say, a shining example. It's leading in the way of the vaccination. There has been no official response yet from the European Parliament concerning the vaccination campaign in Israel. But on the other hand, as Parliament, we have shown that we are very interested in having a good dialogue with Israel about their vaccination campaign. Some weeks ago, for example, as Vice Chair of the Delegation for the Contacts with Israel, as a delegation, we had a good meeting with experts from Israel for exchanging views. I think that was a really good meeting we had. And yes, I hope that it will give Israel new friends, and not and the vaccination campaign is not the only reason. I think there are a lot of reasons to become a good friend of Israel.
And Charlie, I'm sure would agree. There are many reasons to be a good friend of Israel. But when it comes to this new situation, are there more friends now in the European Parliament as a result of developments in the last year?
You know, Tomas, many of us have closely followed Israel's successes, especially as we note the utter failure of the Commission's COVID-19 vaccination strategy. But have there been any official reactions to Israel's success? Of course not, because it puts the EU's efforts into a bad light. What I think is that here in Brussels, we need more transparency from the Commission regarding how these contracts were negotiated, with these pharmaceutical companies, and an explanation as to why the vaccine rollout has been so slow across Europe. And I think Europe and the EU should learn here from Israel's strategy, as our future health and economy depend on it.
Yes, I completely agree. The theme of this program is more to look beyond the pandemic and to see the changes geopolitically in the world. And what has happened since we last met is not only that there is a pandemic, but there's also a new administration in Washington. Taking into account the important transatlantic relations, this has clear ramifications also EU policy in the Middle East. But what are your assessment of the change of administration now in Washington? How will it affect EU policies in the Middle East? Are you optimist or pessimistic? Charlie, if we start with you.
Well, I don't think it will be as bad as some feared prior to the election. However, I think that we will see some setbacks. I'm thinking of the U.S. policy on UNRWA, which is likely to return to a pre-Trump situation under the Biden administration. And also, I think that there will be a softer line towards the Palestinian leadership in terms of the PA support for terrorism and their rejectionist stance towards peace with Israel. And yeah, I mean, for me, this is problematic because the EU needs to work with its own challenges there. Our taxpayers' money are really spent in support of Palestinian terrorism, and we need to work on that. And of course, the EU leadership on this has been an inspiration. And if Biden returns to a softer stance, then that inspiration will evaporate. So in order to be optimistic about in the Middle East, it's important to stand strong on our condemnation of Palestinian rejectionism and its continued support for terrorism. And well, I think on a positive note, the Biden administration has praised the Abraham Accords, and they have said that they will seek to continue to build on this historic momentum. The hearings with Secretary Blinken confirmed that. So there are some positive aspects, but yeah, also some really disconcerting parts.
Yeah. Bert-Jan, you are the vice chair of the European Parliament delegation to the Knesset. Have you been in touch with the US counterpart already to assess the situation, or what are your expectations of this new administration?
Yeah, well, as delegation for the contact with Israel, we had good contacts indeed with the Knesset and with the colleagues in Israel. I have not spoken with colleagues in the United States about the new situation, but I think we can say that we saw a lot of positive developments in the past years, with close ties between Washington and Israel. And under the new president, I think it will be difficult to match the endeavors of the previous president. But in my view, the situation could have been much worse when we would have had another Democrat in the White House. I'm quite optimistic as Biden wants to build on the peace accords that were brokered under the Trump administration. and until now, we can see that the EU did not play any substantial role in the peace process. The EU was on the sideline, criticizing Trump, criticizing Israel, and hopefully the election of a new president in the United States can create, let's say, maybe a new momentum for the EU to change their approach and to become more constructive and more proactive in connection to the peace process.
If we break down this question in concrete policy areas, are there areas of particular concern, and I should say, are there areas where you are hopeful, perhaps even more hopeful than during the previous administration? One thing, of course, which is clear is that we can expect the EU and the US to work more closely together, hand in hand. But it remains to be seen if that is a good thing or not. But Charlie, what are your thoughts? If you look at the expectations, positive and negative, worst case scenario and the best case scenario, if you wish.
Well, I mean, the greatest challenge that we have ahead of us is the engagement with Iran, and the worst case scenario would, of course, be a backtrack to the policies of Obama. But we have indications that may not be the case. The Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has been signaling that countering Iran will be central to President Biden's Middle East agenda, and also that the U.S. will also look at Iran's destabilizing regional behavior and the ballistic missile development of theirs. And the latter will be key to address Iran's destabilizing role in the region and its ballistic missiles development is vital both to the U.S. and to Europe, and think that we can work together there. Any rejoining of the U.S. to the GCPOA, I think, should be viewed with much apprehension. Time and time again, Iranians have shown that they cannot be trusted. The Islamic Republic cannot be trusted. Despite their supposed assurances, they violated agreements and continue to pursue nuclear weapons. So, Biden administration's position that the U.S. will only rejoin the agreement for compliance remains to be close watched. So this is the key.
Yeah, but that was quite a rather optimistic outlook in general. Bert-Jan, what are your worst case scenarios or best case scenarios for this new cooperation?
Well, one of the challenges of the EU is I think how to enter into closer cooperation with the US on a whole series of issues. And I'm not too positive in this stage, to be honest. As we, for example, see the EU bypassing the US when it came to the investment agreement between the EU and China. I think that was not a good first step under the, let's say, new situation with President Biden as well, President of the United States. Another main challenge for the future is how to deal indeed with Iran. Biden makes no secret of his wish to revive the nuclear agreement. And this is a challenge, I think, for all parties. And I hope that all parties will take the security concerns of Israel in this respect very seriously. Because we have to stop Iran. We have to stop Iran. Because Iran is a big threat for stability in the region and for security of Israel. So I think, especially speaking about Iran, close cooperation with the United States and Israel is very needed.
It is interesting indeed that on the eve of Purim, we are still speaking about the threat coming from Persia, from Iran. And I know that you Charlie, have a large fan club in the Iranian diaspora around the world, because you have been a very vocal member of European Parliament to address these issues, human rights violations inside of Iran, but also the threat that the Islamic Republic has on its neighbors and the whole Middle East region. Which leads me to the question of the nuclear agreement. And this is, of course, the big question. Still today, 2,400 years after Purim, the biggest security threat for Israel comes from Iran. What are your, Charlie, what are your thoughts on the way forward? We know, as you said and Bert-Jan said, that the Biden administrations have made it clear that they want to re-engage. At the same time, we know that many European powers have been rather reluctant. But how should we read this situation?
Well, it will be, on the one hand, interesting to see whether the Biden administration will keep many sanctions against Iran that are in place, including making it illegal to trade with the country. We know that the EU has been pushing for more trade and economic relations, despite Iran's flagrant violation of human rights and for terrorism. One test, one example indication will come next week when the EU organized Iran Business Forum will take place. And together with Bert-Jan and MEP Fortiga, we have written a letter to ask for the EU's assurances that High Representative Borrell and EU officials will not participate in the forum. Their potential participation would totally send the wrong message to the Iranian regime. And I think it will be important to keep an eye on the shifts taking place in the US policy towards Iran. If played right, it could serve a great opportunity to get tough on Iran, but if not handled right, could pose as one of the greatest challenges that affects not only the security in Iran, the Middle East, but also here in Europe, as Iran, as we know, continues to be involved in and plan terrorist activities on European soil, including the execution of activists critical of the Iranian regime.
Yes, maybe we should send a message from this program to a High Representative that the next trip after Moscow should be to Tehran, and the stance should be just as consistent in pointing out human rights violations. And I'm not saying this jokingly, but very seriously, that we need to hold our European leaders accountable for these universal rights and freedoms. Bert-Jan, we are coming to, this is a fast-paced program, it's a half-hour program. Still, we are covering many areas. Let me ask you about we mentioned the Abraham Accords, and interestingly for us, we had a policy conference in December where we spoke with the EU leader of the North Africa, Middle East region of European External Action Service. And very interestingly, he was very generous and spoke very highly about the achievements of the the previous U.S. administration in clinching these historic deals in the region. Now, of course, the big question is, Bert-Jan, what are the prospects for, we saw all these historic, there was one after another of historic agreements. We haven't seen any now in the last few months, but can we expect the momentum to last in 2021 going into 2022, and can we expect the European External Action Service to play a more proactive and constructive role in actually promoting peace in the region and peace between Israel and her former enemies?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that there are indeed possibilities, and we argue always also in the direction of Mr. Borrell. Please be let's be more proactive and constructive. And I think one of the problems now is that the narrative of the EU is again and again that first of all we have to solve the Israel-Palestinian issue before we can negotiate and reach a kind of peace agreements in the Middle East. But I think the historical accords shows us that it is possible to find ways for peace agreements with the Arab world without first solving the Palestinian issue. So that is what also Mr. Borrell has to learn. The fact we still have to solve the problem with Palestinians, but it's not. Well, he's using it now as kind of a precondition before he is going in the direction of a more constructive role, and I think that's the main lesson. And I think Borrell has to change his mind in that respect. And then I see, I have hope for a better relation between Israel and the EU.
Thank you, Bert-Jan. We are coming to the final minute, more or less, and this only shows how much there is to cover in the Middle East. But both of you are long-standing friends of Israel and the Jewish people, and you are those that many in the Jewish community put their trust in to promote a fair treatment of Jews in general and the state of Israel in particular. What are your priorities or most important projects now in 2021? I know we have only covered a fraction of the issues which are really of importance for us and for the Jewish communities. But Charlie, do you have, of course, we are still in this half lockdown, so bringing people into the European Parliament is not possible for the time being. But what are your priorities or your wish list, nevertheless?
Well, there are quite a few. First, I will continue to speak out in support of Israel and strengthen EU-Israel relations in every aspect whenever the opportunity arises, such as in plenary debates, resolutions, and written questions. Secondly, I will continue to raise the unacceptable EU funding, either directly or indirectly, to Palestinian terrorist organizations and violent and non-violent extremist organizations in Europe, such as Muslim Brotherhood and its affiliates. I've been very active on this since my election as a member of the European Parliament, and I will be very soon publishing some research on this in order to pressure the EU to stop its funding of such organizations. Thirdly, one thing that concerns me is the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, and it is a matter that is close to my heart. I've spoken of the need to combat anti-Semitism also recently during the International Holocaust Memorial Day and will continue to do so as an MEP. The Jewish community is an integral part of Europe, and it is our moral obligation and responsibility to ensure that Jewish communities can continue to thrive and be safe in Europe, both now and in the future.
Thank you, Charlie. We value and appreciate your words and your commitment. Bert-Jan, you get the final word in this program.
Well, as vice chair of the Israel delegation in the parliament, I will continue to work on improving the relation between the EU and Israel in a lot of areas. We can work together in the fight against COVID. We can work together in strengthening our relation in the field of research and development and so on, in the field of trade. And I think it's also important to work in the parliament on, well, better understanding of the situation in Israel. I will do that, for example, by organizing sometimes conferences or webinars. Next week, for example, I organize a webinar for members of the European Parliament with the Minister for Jerusalem Heritages, Rabbi Rafi Peretz. So just one example to show you well, how we work in the Parliament, and that we will work on, let's say, showing the real situation in Israel and how good it is to be a friend of Israel and to work together with Israel in a constructive way.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. It's been an honor again to have you in the studio, but I'm very much looking forward to see you live again and to feel the vibes of the European Parliament, which we have done over so many years now. This is the European Report, and we will be back again next month with new topics and with new panelists. And in the meantime, we say thank you and good evening from Helsinki, Finland, and from Brussels, Belgium, and from the Netherlands. Bert-Jan, where exactly is it that you are in the Netherlands?
It's Krimpen aan de IJssel. That's a village in the neighborhood of Rotterdam.
If you can say that word, if you can repeat that word with the correct pronunciation, you will win a prize. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next month.